grew up on a dairy farm, right? So in some sense, farmers are very relentlessly practical people. And so in that sense, being in philosophy is surprising. But I grew up on a dairy farm in sort of the CRC parts of Southern Ontario, right? And in that particular group, it's not so surprising perhaps to end up doing something like philosophy because the ICS was such a big role there. My dad for a long time was on the executive committee of an organization called the Christian Farmers Federation of Ontario, right, which is one of these organizations that grew up out of this reformational philosophical background, or out of that soil, this sense that we need Christian organizations, not just Christian schools, but Christian labor organizations like CLAC, Christian, in this case, farmers unions, right? All these kinds of things going on. My dad was always part of that. My dad was always a sort of one of these people who would answer a question with a question, right? And I remember always after, church services, my parents would have people over and they'd be talking about the sermon and trying to make sense of it and understand it, right? So there was always this sort of theological and philosophical discussions in the background of my very blue collar upbringing, and those always stuck with me, right? I was always a thinker. I remain. My wife will be the first person to tell you I think way too much. It's not healthy how much thinking I do, right? Sometimes you just need to make a decision, right? So I've always been thoughtful, thinking about all these kinds of things. And so I guess even in high school with my friends, we'd sit around and think about these big picture questions and what is God, and why should we believe in God, and all these kinds of things, right? And so I got to university, and this was back when you could go to university without knowing what you were going to do, right? Like you just went, and it was a liberal arts university, and you went, and some people knew what they were going to do as first years, but lots of people didn't. I'd say like a third of people, maybe more, didn't have a major declared when they started, right? You were there to kind of find what you wanted to do, and you took a little bit of everything until you find what clicked. And so I always sort of just took to the classes that were interesting to me, and it turns out a lot of those were philosophy classes. I liked thinking about the big picture questions, and I liked thinking about trying to understand how the world works, and how God fits into that picture. And especially when because I went to Calvin for my undergrad, right? We obviously there, another Reformed place, and a lot of questions and courses there about how does our faith fit into what we're learning about everything from epistemology to geology, right? How do we do this as Christian scholars and as Christian thinkers? And so that's one of the questions that has always stuck with me, right? Is I was raised, nurtured into this deep-seated conviction that whatever our faith in God is, whatever our religion is, either it changes everything in our life, or it's nothing, right? Or it doesn't matter, right? If it's going to be real and genuine, it has to be transformative of all of our lives and of our whole world in some sense. And so I have spent most of my life as a young adult trying to figure out, what does that even mean, right? Like, how could, my faith change everything? That doesn't even make sense, right? It's a thing I believe. I believe God exists, or I believe God doesn't. But what does that have to do with anything else, right? And so it's been a long and a slow process of trying to figure out, what would it mean? What would faith have to be? What would religion have to be if it was to be the kind of thing that does change and transform everything that we do? And how do we make sense of that? And how could we understand that? And so that's really been a lot of my journey, both my faith journey, but also my philosophical journey, trying to understand that question and those kinds of questions, right? And so the shift for me from thinking my faith primarily in terms of what in philosophy we would call a belief without sufficient evidence, right? Something I think is true, but I don't have enough evidence to say I know for sure. And that's what faith is. Faith gives us that belief without sufficient evidence. And shifting from that to something like what Jamie Smith would nowadays call it, faith as an ultimate love, right? Following Augustine, right? The sense that it's not primarily first about what I think. My faith is about what I want, what shapes my heart, and so shapes my whole life, and therefore shapes everything I want and everything I do, right? And from that, then the transition for me into this phenomenological kind of philosophy. So phenomenology is like a philosophy of experience, trying to make sense of how do we experience and make sense of the world, and how is that different maybe from person to person, and how is it similar for groups of people raised in this area or raised in that, right? So what are the factors that go into how we make sense of our experience of the world, right? And that's the sort of the phenomenological question. And so that's really been pushing me in recent years to think of these ultimate loves, these fundamental driving forces, in terms of what I and what others will call like sort of spiritualities or spirits of the age, right? Like consumerism as a kind of a spiritual force that shapes us to experience the world in very individualistic ways, in ways that really sort of give us as individuals the illusion of control, or ways that reduce everything to sort of valuations that we put onto the world rather than seeing value in the world itself, right? Those kinds of questions, and thinking of our experiences being shaped by these spiritual forces is really where a lot of my contemporary research is now, and trying to make sense of kind of how that works, right? How do these spiritual forces work and shape our experience? And then also, what are the spirits that are working on us this in this day and age, and how are they shaping us and shaping us? And then how, once we learn of this spiritual dimension to our experience, is there anything we can do to sort of attune ourselves to certain spiritualities and not others, right? Or how do we attune ourselves in the context of as Christians to the spirit of God at work in the world, and not simply be caught up in spirits of consumerism or individualism or other kinds of forces and factors, right? So that's a kind of a lot of where my thought is and where my journey has been, that's led me into philosophy, but then also what drives me as a philosopher and as a thinker, and how do we try to make sense of these things?